August 1944. The California sun burned over endless rows of cotton and tomatoes as trucks rolled to a stop outside a fenced field in Kern County. The men stepping out weren't farmhands. They were German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa and shipped across the ocean. They expected chains, punishment, maybe starvation. Instead, an American foreman handed them baskets and said, "You'll be paid 80 cents a day." The prisoners laughed at first, thinking it a cruel joke. But when noon came, guards passed out sandwiches, fruit, and coffee. That night, the men received Canteen coupons, real wages they could spend on cigarettes and soap. In a country they'd been taught to hate, they were working, eating, and being paid better than many civilians back home. What they saw in those fields, electric lights, machinery, and quiet fairness, would begin to dismantle years of Nazi propaganda. This is the story of how enemy soldiers found humanity in California's harvest. October 2nd, 1944. The morning light over Kern County, California, came down like molten glass. Heat shimmered across the flat horizon, turning distant trees into wavering silhouettes. From Highway 155, a convoy of olive-drab trucks moved slowly through cotton country, dust curling behind the wheels. Inside, the passengers sat in silence, their grey uniforms damp with sweat. The letters stenciled across their backs read simply, PW, Prisoner of War. Most of them had been captured in Tunisia a year earlier. Veterans of the Africa Corps. They had crossed the Atlantic packed into liberty ships, believing they were bound for punishment, starvation, or worse. Instead, they found themselves traveling deeper into the American heartland, past glowing towns, farms lit by electric lights, and gas stations that never seemed to run out of fuel. What waited for them at the end of that journey was something no propaganda could have prepared them for. A cotton field. Camp Lamont stood near the small farming town of Lamont, south of Bakersfield. From the air, it looked like a miniature fortress. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire, with 4 guard towers at each corner and floodlights that cut through the night. But compared to the prison camps of Europe, it was almost comfortable. Inside the fences, the men slept on cots with mattresses, ate 3 meals a day, and showered with hot water. There were no beatings, no starvation, no freezing nights in concrete cells. Still, the idea of being brought to California, a place they had only heard of in American films and magazines, felt surreal. When the trucks stopped at the main gate, the men were ordered out. The American guards, most of them barely older than the prisoners, wore wide-brimmed hats and mirrored sunglasses. One of them spoke in slow, careful German. "Welcome to Camp Lamont," he said. "You will work. You will be paid. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The words, "you will be paid," drew quiet laughter among the men. No one believed it. Prisoners didn't earn wages. Prisoners endured. But the next morning, as the sun climbed over the San Joaquin Valley, they were marched into the fields with baskets and burlap sacks. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, white as snow with cotton blooms. An American foreman in overalls, his shirt soaked through with sweat, pointed to the rows and gave a simple order. "Pick clean. Don't miss the bowls. Lunch at noon." And then, without ceremony, the work began. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the lungs. Cotton scratches the skin, and the men quickly learned how easily the fibers cut through the fabric of their uniforms. Some sang under their breath, old marching songs from Africa, while others worked in silence, trying to ignore the guards standing watch from the fence line. But there was something different about these guards. Their posture relaxed, their rifles slung low. They didn't shout. They didn't curse from Saul. Occasionally, one of them would hand out a cigarette. By midday, the foreman shouted for a break. The prisoners gathered under a few scraggly trees where field trucks waited. From inside came the smell of food, real food. Tin trays of sandwiches, apples, and coffee poured from thermoses. The guards ate alongside them. There were no insults, no blows, just the sound of chewing and the buzzing of flies. One prisoner, Corporal Ernst Becker, stared at the white bread in disbelief. He had not seen anything like it since before the war. "They feed us like workers," he whispered to the man beside him. "Not like enemies." That night, after the trucks returned them to camp, the men lined up at the canteen window. Each received small printed coupons, stamped Camp Lamont Canteen Scrip. They could not be exchanged for dollars, only used within the camp to buy small comforts: cigarettes, soap, candy, postcards, writing paper. It was, by American regulation, a fair wage, 80 cents a day. Most of them didn't know what to do with it. In Germany, prisoners of war were unpaid labor, often starved or beaten into obedience. Here, they were treated as laborers under protection of international law. The next morning, a man named Lieutenant Karl Meissner wrote in his journal, "If they wished to break us, they would do it with cruelty. Instead, they confuse us with kindness." For weeks, the rhythm of Camp Lamont became routine. Wake at dawn, roll call, trucks to the fields, hours of bending, pulling, sweating. Lunch, more work. Return by dusk. Showers, dinner, and lights out at 10. Yet within that routine, something began to shift among the men. They watched the American system at work, efficient, methodical, casual in its abundance. Electric pumps irrigated the fields, tractors and harvesters rolled past, engines humming. Everything moved with a sense of endless supply. There was no shortage of fuel, no shortage of tools, no shortage of food. The guards joked that America had enough wheat to feed the world twice over. To men from a continent gripped by rationing and ruin, it seemed like sorcery. The farmers who oversaw their labor were not soldiers, but civilians, ordinary Americans in worn boots and wide hats. Some were kind, others stern, but few were cruel. They spoke slowly, often trying to bridge the language gap with gestures and patient repetition. Over time, the Germans learned the rhythm of farm life: how to tie cotton sacks, when to break, how to load the trucks without tearing the bales. The guards grew used to them, too. By October's end, the fields were alive with quiet cooperation. Enemy soldiers and American farmers working side by side in the California sun. At night, the camp glowed faintly from electric lights strung along the barracks. For men who had grown used to blackout curtains and darkness enforced by air raids, the glow felt unnatural, almost magical. "Even the nights are bright here," one prisoner wrote. "In Germany, light is danger. Here, it means safety." The psychological impact of that difference was profound. The men began to speak less about the Reich and more about America, about the strange normalcy of a nation at war that seemed untouched by hardship. They marveled at how women drove tractors and trucks, how children rode bicycles freely down sunlit streets. When the guards mentioned that every farm had electricity and running water, the prisoners argued. It was impossible, they said. Only rich men in Germany had such things. The guards shrugged and told them to wait until they saw Bakersfield. Every few weeks, trucks from the Red Cross arrived, delivering mail, medical supplies, and parcels from home. The letters from Germany grew shorter, bleaker. Cities bombed. Factories destroyed. Food scarce. The contrast between those words and the world around them grew unbearable. One night, in the barracks, Sergeant Otto Gerlach read a letter from his wife aloud to his bunkmates. "The ration for butter has been reduced again," she wrote. "There is no coal. The winter will be hard." Otto folded the letter slowly. Around him, the room was warm, the lights steady, the air filled with the faint hum of an electric fan. He said nothing more. The guards, though always armed, often treated the prisoners with a strange civility. They spoke of baseball games, radio shows, and movie stars. When the men finished their daily quotas early, the guards sometimes let them rest under the trees, passing around a shared pack of Lucky Strikes. Some Germans began trading handmade trinkets, carved wood, small sketches, for cigarettes or candy bars. The local community, though initially wary, gradually grew curious. Farmers appreciated the help. The war had drained California's labor force. Young men were overseas, and the Bracero program, bringing Mexican laborers, had not yet filled the gap. German prisoners became the unexpected solution. They picked cotton, harvested tomatoes, and even helped prune vineyards near Delano. Their work kept the wartime economy afloat. Yet for all its order, Camp Lamont was still a prison. The fences reminded them of that. The towers, the rifles that glinted under the sun. Every evening, roll call was counted down to the last man. A single escape could bring punishment for all. The rule was simple: work hard, follow orders, cause no trouble. Not all obeyed. On October 18th, a group of prisoners led by Feldwebel Heinrich Bauer refused to board the trucks. They claimed the heat and long hours violated their rights under the Geneva Convention. The Americans called it a strike. The Germans called it a protest. For 2 days, they refused to work. The guards confined them to barracks on bread and water until they relented. Bauer was transferred to another camp. The others returned to the fields, quiet and subdued. The incident became known as the Shafter Strike, after the nearby town where it occurred. To the Americans, it was a minor disruption. To the Germans, it was a lesson that even defiance here carried consequences without cruelty. No whips, no executions, no beatings. Just discipline, written down and carried out with bureaucratic precision. As autumn deepened, the cotton harvest neared completion. The prisoners began to understand the strange rhythm of their captivity, a system where work was not punishment, but necessity, where obedience was rewarded with small freedoms. They could attend classes, read American newspapers, even listen to radio broadcasts approved by camp officers. English lessons became popular. Some men volunteered to paint signs or repair equipment. Others joined the camp orchestra, using instruments provided by the YMCA. It was in these small acts that the transformation began. A few started to question what they had been taught about America, about democracy, about strength. If this was weakness, it was a kind unlike anything they had known. One Sunday evening, after a day of rest, Lieutenant Meissner stood outside his barrack watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and violet over the fields. In the distance, the sound of a tractor rumbled softly. "They fight with machines," he said to no one in particular, "and they live with light." In November, a group of prisoners was reassigned to nearby tomato farms under contract with Hammond General Hospital. They picked and packed the produce that would feed American soldiers recovering from wounds. Some realized for the first time that their labor was feeding the very men who had captured them. Yet even that irony felt distant. The work was honest, the pay steady, the treatment fair. As winter approached, the heat eased, and the San Joaquin nights grew cold. The camp installed small coal stoves in each barrack. Blankets were issued. The men built makeshift Christmas trees from scrap wood and tinsel provided by local church groups. On Christmas Eve, the guards allowed them to sing carols in German. One prisoner, a former music teacher from Stuttgart, played a violin, while others hummed along. The guards listened from outside the barracks, silent. For a few moments, the war felt far away. When spring came, the cotton fields bloomed again. The same prisoners returned to work, sunburned and lean, but no longer resentful. Many had grown used to the routine. They joked with guards, traded words of English for words of German, even waved at passing farmers who sometimes honked their truck horns in greeting. By mid-1945, Camp Lamont had processed over 2,000 prisoners. Fewer than a dozen had attempted escape, none successfully. Most would later be transferred north or east as the war wound down. But the memory of California lingered. Years later, diaries recovered from the archives in Washington told their story in quiet detail. The blistering heat, the endless fields, the confusion of being paid for honest labor by one's enemy. Over and over, one phrase appeared. They paid us. It was more than money. It was proof of something deeper, that in the heart of a world at war, even enemies could be treated as men. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the men of Camp Lamont gathered in silence around the camp loudspeakers to hear the news. Some wept, others simply stared at the ground. The guards said nothing. The next morning, work continued as usual. Cotton still needed picking. The war, at least in those fields, was over. Months later, as repatriation began, the prisoners prepared to return to a homeland in ruins. They packed their few belongings: letters, sketches, canteen coupons folded like souvenirs. One guard told them, "When you go home, tell them how you were treated here." And many did. For decades afterward, former prisoners would write back to the families who had sent them food, to the farmers who had spoken kindly, to the guards who had smiled. They remembered not the fences, but the sunlight, the bread, the fairness. In those small details lay the beginning of understanding. A bridge built not by diplomats or generals, but by cotton and kindness. In the end, Camp Lamont was not just a prison. It was a mirror. In its reflection, captured soldiers saw a version of America their leaders had sworn did not exist. A land where even enemies could earn a wage, eat their fill, and find a measure of dignity beneath the California sun. March 11th, 1945. The fog came early that morning, rolling low across California's Central Valley like smoke from a distant fire. Dew clung to the tomato vines, and the air smelled faintly of earth, diesel, and damp straw. From the gravel road leading to Hammond General Hospital, a small convoy of army trucks approached, headlights cutting through the mist. Inside, rows of men in grey uniforms sat shoulder to shoulder, silent except for the rattle of the engine. Stenciled on the backs of their jackets were 2 black letters: POW, Prisoner of War. They were bound for the Vernalis branch camp, a satellite facility built on the outskirts of San Joaquin County, about 70 miles south of Sacramento. Technically, it was not a prison in the traditional sense. It was a labor camp, one of hundreds scattered across the United States, created to meet the desperate demand for farm workers as American men fought overseas. But to the German soldiers sitting in those trucks, it felt like another world entirely. A place where the line between captivity and freedom blurred beneath the California sun. The camp itself sat beside an airstrip once used for pilot training. By 1945, the wooden barracks had been converted to house nearly 500 German prisoners, most of them captured in North Africa and Italy. A barbed wire fence encircled the compound, watched by a handful of guards who spent more time reading newspapers than standing at attention. The nearby Hammond General Hospital, one of the largest Army medical centers on the West Coast, oversaw their welfare and work assignments. The hospital's kitchens, laundries, and supply lines all relied on prisoner labor. But most of the men would find themselves beyond the fences, working the surrounding farmland, the tomato fields, vineyards, and orchards that fed the hospital and neighboring canneries. When the trucks stopped that first morning, the prisoners climbed down into the fog. A foreman waited. Hands on his hips, his straw hat already beaded with moisture. He didn't salute, didn't shout, just pointed toward the rows of tomato plants, stretching into the mist. "You'll work in pairs," he said through an interpreter. "Fill the crates. Be careful with the fruit. No bruises. You'll be paid the same as the others. 80 cents a day." The men exchanged uncertain glances. The memory of Camp Lamont's cotton fields was still fresh in many minds. That camp had been hot, dusty, and endless. But this was different. The air here was cooler, the soil darker, the plants thick and green. When the fog lifted by mid-morning, the sky revealed itself in a clear, brilliant blue. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of the hospital chapel rang for morning service. Work began in silence. The Germans bent over the vines, cutting ripe tomatoes and stacking them carefully in wooden crates. The foremen, mostly civilian farmers contracted by the War Department, moved along the rows with clipboards, checking quality and yield. Armed guards stood at the perimeter, but spoke little. The prisoners quickly realized that escape was pointless. There was nowhere to run. The valley stretched for miles, every direction the same pattern of fields and irrigation canals. Besides, even if they did run, they would stand out immediately. Their gray uniforms were marked, their accents impossible to hide. By noon, the fog had burned away and the temperature climbed. The men rested in the shade of the trucks, eating sandwiches handed out by guards. Thick slices of white bread, cold ham, an apple, and coffee poured into tin cups. The prisoners ate quietly, watching the hospital workers drive past in jeeps and ambulances. Beyond the road, the massive white buildings of Hammond General shimmered in the heat, wards and laboratories and kitchens large enough to feed thousands. To the prisoners, it looked like an entire city dedicated to healing the men they had once fought. Corporal Ernst Wilke, who had served with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "We fought men who build hospitals larger than our cities. They heal while they fight." I do not understand this country. Each evening, the trucks returned them to the camp. The barracks smelled of soap and dust, the walls lined with bunks built from California pine. Electric lights glowed from the ceiling. They could shave, shower, and even write letters. A small canteen sold cigarettes, stationery, and candy. all purchased with the same camp-issued scrip they earned in the fields. Some nights they played chess or wrote postcards home, describing the strange, orderly world they found themselves in. "We work for our enemies," one prisoner wrote to his mother in Bavaria, "and yet they treat us like men. We harvest their food, and they pay us. It is madness, but a kind of madness I prefer." As spring deepened, the tomato harvest accelerated. California's war economy depended on it. The canneries of Stockton and Modesto processed tens of thousands of tons of tomatoes each month, shipping canned goods to American troops across the Pacific. Every hand mattered, even German ones. The prisoners worked long days, often 12 hours or more, but the work was not forced in the brutal sense. Those who refused simply lost privileges or pay. For most, the labor became a rhythm, something to anchor the endless uncertainty of captivity. A few prisoners were assigned directly to Hammond General Hospital. They scrubbed floors, washed linens, and carried supplies between wards. The irony was not lost on them. Men who had fought in the desert were now changing sheets for wounded Americans. One, a young medical student named Heinrich Adler, was placed in the hospital's pathology lab. Under supervision, he sterilized instruments and helped catalog tissue samples. His American supervisor, a lieutenant from Ohio, noticed his skill and lent him English textbooks. By summer, Adler could carry full conversations about medicine. Years later, he would return to Germany and become a doctor. In his memoir, he wrote simply, "I learned the value of life from those I was taught to hate." Back in the fields, the rhythm of work and rest blurred the edges of captivity. Guards grew more relaxed, sometimes helping with the loading when the yield was heavy. Locals driving by on country roads would slow their trucks to watch, amazed at the sight of former enemies harvesting tomatoes under the California sun. Some stopped to talk, others offered cigarettes or water. There were still townspeople who disapproved, who believed the prisoners were treated too well. But most understood the truth. Without them, the crops would rot in the fields. By June, the valley was a sea of green. Tomato vines climbed the stakes like winding ropes, heavy with fruit. The air buzzed with insects, the distant hum of irrigation pumps, and the occasional laughter of men who had stopped being soldiers long enough to become workers again. Inside the camp, daily life followed a familiar pattern. Breakfast was served at 6, oatmeal, bread, and coffee. Work began at 7, dinner at 6:30. Afterward, the men were free to walk the fenced compound. A small library opened in one barrack, stocked with donated books and magazines. YMC. Our volunteers brought chess sets and soccer balls. Occasionally, films were shown, American movies dubbed in German. They watched Casablanca and Yankee Doodle Dandy projected onto a white sheet. Some laughed at the cliches. Others sat in silence, mesmerized by the images of music, light, and abundance. The guards noticed the change in morale. Fights became rare. Discipline improved. The once defiant veterans of Africa and Italy now spoke less of Hitler and more of home, of families, of peace, of rebuilding. Not all adapted so easily. A few men clung to the old beliefs. They whispered about Germany's secret weapons, about victory still possible. But news filtered into camp through radios and newspapers. They saw headlines announcing Allied advances, the collapse of Berlin, the surrender of Italy. Reality eroded the illusions day by day. One morning in July, an American sergeant brought a newspaper into the mess hall. The front page showed the ruins of Cologne. The prisoners stared at the photograph in silence, streets reduced to rubble, the cathedral standing alone amid devastation. "Our city," one man said quietly. No one answered. The work continued. The relationship between Hammond General and the camp grew closer that summer. Doctors visited the site to inspect the prisoners' health. Several remarked on their good condition compared to the war-torn civilians of Europe. The hospital staff treated minor injuries, dispensed vitamins, and vaccinated every man for typhoid and tetanus. It was efficiency born of policy, but to the prisoners it felt like an impossible luxury. In letters, they described it again and again: cleanliness, order, abundance. The tomato harvest reached its peak in August. The heat was brutal. Days over 100 degrees, the air thick with the smell of sun-baked soil. The men wore wood hats and bandanas like American farmhands. They learned to pace themselves, to work with rhythm rather than force. At noon, the guards brought large metal jugs filled with water and salt tablets to prevent fainting. That month, the canneries ran 24 hours a day. Trains loaded with freight left Stockton bound for ports on the Pacific. The prisoners, sweating in the fields, knew their labor was part of something far larger than themselves. And though it served their captors, there was a strange satisfaction in it. The satisfaction of being useful again. In late August, a group of local high school students visited the camp as part of a community program. They brought baseballs, notebooks, and candy bars, exchanging them for wooden carvings the prisoners had made in their spare time. One boy, 16-year-old Henry Morales, later told a newspaper reporter, "They didn't seem like enemies. Just men who wanted to go home." By autumn, the war in Europe was nearly over. The prisoners sensed it in the guards' relaxed posture, the softened tone of the foreman, the steady talk of peace. On September the 2nd, news arrived that Japan had surrendered. The war was officially ended. The camp erupted in a strange mix of celebration and silence. Some cheered, others sat quietly, unsure how to feel. The guards shook hands with the men they had once watched with suspicion. That night, the floodlights were turned off for the first time. The camp slept in darkness and peace. But the end of the war did not mean freedom. Repatriation would take months. The men still worked the fields as autumn came, harvesting the last of the crops. The guards spoke of demobilization, of going home to wives and children. The prisoners listened, wondering if they would ever see theirs again. In October, a truck from Hammond General arrived with boxes of donated clothes: American Army shirts, wool coats, socks and gloves. The men were allowed to keep them for the journey home. Before winter, the first groups began to leave, transferred to processing centers where they would eventually board ships back to Europe. On the morning of his departure, Corporal Wilk stood outside the barrack where he had lived for nearly a year. The tomato vines in the distance had turned brown, their fruit long picked. The fields were quiet. He looked around. The guard tower, the fences, the rows of wooden huts, and said softly, "It was a good prison." The truck rolled away, passing through the gates that had once seemed unbreakable. For most, the journey home would take months, but the impressions of Vernalis stayed with them for a lifetime. They spoke of the camp not as punishment, but as revelation, of the guards who treated them with fairness, of the doctors who healed them, of the fields that taught them what peace felt like. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners across Germany, many mentioned the same small details: the taste of American coffee, the laughter of guards, the bright electric lights that burned all night, the way the tomato fields glowed red at sunset. Some had brought home the Canteen coupons as souvenirs. Others still kept the postcards they had written from Vernalis, never mailed but carefully folded in old diaries. One letter, found in an archive decades later, ended with a simple line written in careful German script. "If this is defeat, then it is gentler than victory." The Vernalis branch camp closed quietly in early 1946. The barracks were dismantled, the fences torn down, the land returned to farmers. Hammond General Hospital continued its work until it too was decommissioned years later. Today, little remains of the camp but the faint outlines of foundations buried beneath orchards and vineyards. The airstrip is gone, the guard towers long forgotten. But every summer, when the tomato fields ripen under the same relentless sun, the ghost of that brief, strange chapter return. Young men in grey uniforms, bent over the vines, discovering that their enemy's kindness could be more disarming than any weapon. They had come expecting cruelty. What they found instead was work, wages, and a glimpse of the world that would rise from the ashes of their homeland. A world built not on conquest, but on quiet, relentless productivity, the hum of machines, and the dignity of labor freely given, even in captivity. And in that, perhaps, lay the greatest irony of all. For in those California fields, far from the ruins of Europe, German prisoners learned their first lessons in the democracy that would one day rebuild their country. They discovered that freedom could exist even behind fences, that power could be merciful, and that a nation's strength was not measured by its armies, but by its abundance. In the silence of those endless rows of tomatoes, between the hum of insects and the crackle of dry leaves, they saw what their own leaders had never understood, that true might is not forged by domination, but by creation. And in the long years that followed, those who returned to Germany carried that lesson with them. The war had ended, but something far more enduring had begun. January 1944. The Atlantic was grey and cold, the waves churning with winter storms. On the deck of a Liberty ship bound for New York, several hundred men huddled against the wind, their faces hollow from defeat. They wore remnants of once proud uniforms, insignias removed, belts confiscated, boots mismatched from years of campaign wear. They were soldiers of the Third Reich, captured in Tunisia, Sicily, and Salerno, now prisoners of the very nation they had been told was weak, divided, and decadent. Few of them knew their destination. Rumors spread through the ranks like whispered prayers. Some said Canada, others England. But when the shoreline appeared through the fog, dotted with lights brighter than any they'd seen in years, they realized the truth. They had reached America. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war would be held in the United States. It was one of the largest mass internments in history, yet few Americans at the time even knew the scale of it. The camp stretched from Maine to California, from the Dakotas to the Gulf Coast, over 500 facilities in total, each one operating under strict Geneva Convention rules. The prisoners had not come voluntarily. They arrived as the byproduct of victory. Surrendered divisions from North Africa, captured crews from the U-boats, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France. When the Allies began their North African campaign in 1942, they suddenly found themselves with tens of thousands of Axis prisoners. The British could not house them all. The Americans offered space, ships, and resources. And so the convoys began. Liberty ships carrying not just weapons and supplies to Europe, but returning with men who had once fired upon them. For the Germans, the first shock came before they even touched American soil. On the voyage, they were fed 3 meals a day: bread, meat, fruit, and coffee. They received medical checks, clean clothes, and even cigarettes. When they reached port, most were stunned to find crowds of dock workers unloading cargo by machine. Cranes, forklifts, and conveyor belts, tools they had rarely seen outside propaganda films. At Norfolk, Boston, and New Orleans, the prisoners were processed in near silence. Fingerprints, photographs, identification numbers. The American guards were professional, efficient, and almost polite. There were no beatings, no shouted insults. The men were informed of their rights under the Geneva Convention: pay, rations, medical care, and correspondence privileges. For many, it was the first time they had heard the words Geneva Convention used seriously. From those ports, they were divided into trains and sent inland. To prevent escape, the routes were kept secret. But through the windows, the prisoners glimpsed an America that defied everything they had been told. Miles of farmland, factories humming day and night, small towns lit up long after midnight. In Germany, blackout regulations had silenced the night sky. Here, the light never seemed to end. By early 1944, the United States had constructed a vast network of POW camps, a system so organized it mirrored a small nation. At the center were 175 main camps, each capable of holding thousands of men. Surrounding them were over 325 branch camps, smaller satellite sites established near farms, mills, and factories. Every camp operated like a miniature town, complete with kitchens, hospitals, libraries, classrooms, and theaters. California alone housed nearly 15,000 German prisoners across more than 24 sites. From Blythe on the Arizona border to the coastal fields of Salinas, they labored where manpower was most needed. The war had drained America's workforce, with millions overseas and domestic industries stretched thin. Farms faced ruin. The government's solution was practical, if unconventional. Let the prisoners work. Under Article 27 of the Geneva Convention, captives could be employed on tasks not directly related to the war effort, provided they were paid a fair wage. The Americans honored it to the letter. Prisoners earned 80 cents a day, not in cash, but in Canteen Scrip redeemable for small comforts: cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and writing paper. The wages were modest, but the symbolism was enormous. It meant the enemy was not to be humiliated, but integrated into the machinery of production. From Texas cotton to California tomatoes, from the forests of Oregon to the sawmills of Minnesota, German hands kept American supply chains moving. They chopped lumber, built roads, repaired railways, and harvested crops that fed both soldiers abroad and civilians at home. The camps themselves varied in character. Some were strict military compounds. Others, like those in the Midwest and California, resembled work colonies more than prisons. Barbed wire surrounded them, but within the fences life carried an unexpected rhythm of normalcy. Each morning, bugles sounded reveille. Men lined up for roll call, collected breakfast trays, and boarded trucks bound for the fields. Guards accompanied them, but more often than not, the rifles stayed slung on shoulders. The risk of escape was low. The prisoners understood that running was futile. Where would they go? The nearest town was often 50 miles away, surrounded by open plains or desert. Even if they escaped, they had nowhere to hide, no allies to turn to, no language to rely on. For most, captivity became a strange kind of stability. They were fed, sheltered, and safe from the chaos consuming their homeland. Letters from Germany told of bombings, hunger, and loss. The contrast was unbearable. A letter preserved in the National Archives captures the sentiment. Written in 1944 by Private Hans Kruger from a camp in Kansas, it reads, "The guards treat us decently. We work in the fields. There is bread every day and even milk. If I write that I am a prisoner, do not weep. I live better than most at home." The American guards themselves were often astonished. Many had never met a German before. They found their captives disciplined, polite, sometimes even friendly. The men saluted officers, kept their barracks spotless, and organized orchestras and sports leagues. Baseball, once a foreign game, became a favorite pastime. In one Texas camp, a prisoner team even challenged their guards, and won. Music filled the camps too. At Camp Swift, Texas, a group of captured musicians formed a full symphony orchestra that performed weekly concerts. In Nebraska, a choir sang Bach and Mozart in the evenings. In Arizona, prisoners painted murals on the walls of their mess halls, scenes of rivers, forests, and villages that reminded them of home. The Americans tolerated it. Some even encouraged it. They saw the value of keeping morale high. An idle prisoner was a dangerous one. A busy prisoner was productive, calm, and far easier to manage. What emerged was an unspoken exchange. The United States gained labor during its greatest shortage. The prisoners, in turn, gained a temporary refuge from the destruction of Europe. But this system was not without tension. Not all Americans approved. Letters to newspapers complained that enemy soldiers were living better than civilians under rationing. "Why do they get meat when we cannot?" one reader wrote to the Los Angeles Times in 1944. The War Department responded with data. Each prisoner received the same calories as an American soldier, as required by international law. It was, officials insisted, a matter of honor, proof that democracy upheld its principles even in war. Inside the camps, ideological divisions also persisted. The prisoners were not a unified group. Among them were true believers in Nazism, professional soldiers, conscripts, and men who had been swept up by the war with no choice. The American command quickly learned to separate the fanatics from the moderates. Each camp maintained an internal hierarchy of prisoners responsible for discipline. Those who attempted to enforce Nazi loyalty through intimidation were transferred to isolation camps. The vast majority, however, simply wanted the war to end. They worked hard, wrote letters, studied English, and waited. By late 1944, the educational programs expanded. The War Department established a Special Projects Division, dedicated to re-education through exposure rather than propaganda. Professors and linguists designed courses in history, economics, and literature. Prisoners could study American civics, learn mathematics, or attend lectures on democracy. Thousands enrolled voluntarily. For many, these classes were their first encounter with free discussion. In Germany, open criticism of government had been unthinkable. Here, they debated freely under the supervision of American teachers. The process planted quiet seeds that would bloom after the war. Seeds of skepticism, curiosity, and self-reflection. In California, where the climate resembled the Mediterranean fields many of them knew, the transition to farm work was surprisingly natural. At camps like Lamont, Shafter, and Vernalis, the men rose before dawn to pick cotton, grapes, or tomatoes. Local farmers, short of hands, learned to rely on them. The work was hard but fair. At the end of each week, the farmers paid the U.S. Army, which credited the prisoners' accounts. Occasionally, friendships formed. Some farmers invited guards and prisoners alike to share lunches in the shade. Children watched the convoys pass, waving at men who waved back. After the war, when the camps closed, many former prisoners wrote letters of gratitude to the families they had worked for. Some even returned years later as immigrants, drawn back by memories of kindness. One of them, a man named Friedrich Ott, would later tell a California newspaper, "I came as a prisoner and left as a student. America taught me what Germany had forgotten, that strength does not need cruelty." Still, it was not paradise. The camps were crowded, the routines repetitive. Letters were censored, movements restricted. The sound of shins or distant gunfire during training exercises could trigger panic among men haunted by the front. But compared to the brutal Eastern Front or the bombed-out cities of Europe, captivity in America was a strange mercy. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the system reached its peak. Nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners scattered across the continent. Now the question became what to do with them. The American public assumed they would be sent home immediately. But the reality was slower. Europe lay in ruins. Transport ships were limited. And the farms still needed labor. For another year, thousands remained, working under the same contracts that had defined their captivity. They helped rebuild roads, clear forests, and repair rail lines. By 1946, as repatriation accelerated, many felt torn. Returning to Germany meant facing hunger, ruin, and uncertainty. Staying meant safety, but captivity. Letters from that final year reveal a quiet melancholy. "I will miss the light," one wrote. "Here, even at night, there is light." When the last ships finally sailed from New York and New Orleans, they carried men forever changed. They had entered America as enemies and left as witnesses to a system that had defeated them not only by might, but by method, an industrial, democratic machine that ran with relentless precision and surprising mercy. In post-war Germany, their testimonies would play a subtle but vital role in Reconstruction. They spoke of American abundance, of efficiency without oppression, of justice applied even to enemies. Historians later called it the psychological turning point, a quiet re-education born not from lectures, but from observation. The statistics tell the scale of it. 425,000 Axis prisoners held across 45 states. Fewer than 1% escaped, and none successfully. 95% later described their treatment as good or excellent. Nearly all were repatriated by 1946, but the numbers don't capture the human story. The men standing in sunlit fields, the guards leaning on rifles and joking with those they watched, the endless trains carrying soldiers across a land of abundance. They don't describe the shock of hot water from a showerhead, the taste of white bread, the flicker of electric lights through a barrack window. Those small moments were what broke the myth of Nazi superiority. Those details, not grand speeches or battles, convinced men that democracy worked. The system of German prisoners of war in the United States was more than a wartime necessity. It was an experiment in decency, a test of whether a nation could uphold its values while holding its enemies captive. America passed that test quietly, without fanfare, through the simple consistency of its rules, the fairness of its rations, and the efficiency of its bureaucracy. The German soldiers who worked its fields and factories returned home with stories that would outlast the war itself. They had seen a land where even prisoners were paid, where even enemies were treated as men. And in that realization, lay the first fragile steps toward reconciliation. Not forged on battlefields, but in the vast, sunlit farms of a country that defeated them through abundance, discipline, and quiet mercy. April 1944. Inside a small wooden building at Camp Hearn, Texas, a line of German prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, each holding a slip of paper the color of faded brown tobacco. The air smelled faintly of dust, sweat, and machine oil. A ceiling fan creaked overhead, spinning lazily against the heat. Behind the counter sat an American corporal. His sleeves rolled up, his voice steady and bored as he called out names. Müller, Schneider, Becker. One by one, the men stepped forward, signed their names in careful block letters, and received small envelopes filled not with money, but with brightly printed coupons. Each piece was stamped with the words, "Prisoner of War, Canteen, Scrip, United States Army." The denominations varied: 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents, sometimes a single dollar. To the untrained eye, they looked like monopoly money, pale blue or green, fragile as theater tickets. But to the men who received them, they represented something extraordinary: wages. Every prisoner who labored under the American system earned 80 cents per day, credited not in cash, but in this strange paper currency that existed only within the wire fences of the camps. It could not be hoarded, exchanged, or sent home. It was money without a nation, a currency that existed solely for men without a country. The POW Scrip system began in 1943, after the first waves of German and Italian prisoners arrived in America. The War Department faced a problem of principle. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be paid for their labor, a fair wage, as the text put it. Yet paying them in real American dollars carried risk. It could encourage black market trading, bribery, or escape attempts. The solution was elegant and controlled: create a closed economy, a miniature world where prisoners could earn and spend under watchful eyes. By design, every camp functioned as a self-contained marketplace. The canteen, a simple wooden store stocked with small comforts, became its economic center. Inside were shelves lined with soap, razors, shaving cream, toothpaste, tobacco, writing paper, pens, chocolate bars, and occasionally soft drinks or fruit preserves. Prices were fixed by the War Department, identical across all camps from Maine to California. A pack of cigarettes cost 10 cents, a bar of soap, 5. A small notebook, 15. To the guards, it was routine. To the prisoners, it was revolutionary. For most of them, money had vanished long before their capture. In the ruins of North Africa and Italy, German paymasters had stopped issuing wages. Soldiers fought for survival, not salary. When captured, they were stripped of everything: watches, coins, letters, and identification. In that sense, the first piece of POW Scrip placed in a prisoner's hand was a symbolic resurrection of normal life. It meant agency, however limited. It meant choice. At Camp Lamont in California, where men picked cotton beneath the relentless sun, pay was recorded weekly. At the end of each period, the canteen clerk posted lists on the barrack doors showing each man's credit: 80 cents per day, minus deductions for cigarettes or stationery purchased on credit. Prisoners lined up eagerly on payday, the line stretching past the gate. The rules were clear. Scrip could only be spent inside the camp. It could not be exchanged between prisoners. It could not leave the compound. If found outside the fence, it was confiscated. To prevent counterfeiting, each camp's scrip carried unique color codes, watermarks, and serial numbers. The paper was fragile, but the trust behind it was absolute. The psychology of the system fascinated American officers. Major John Wilson, a quartermaster assigned to oversee POW logistics, wrote in his 1945 report, "Money confers identity. The enemy without a nation becomes again an individual when he possesses the right to earn, spend, and choose." In other words, the coupons were more than wages. They were quiet instruments of rehumanization. In the California camps, prisoners used them to buy cigarettes or bars of Hershey's chocolate, luxuries unthinkable in wartime Germany. Some saved them for weeks to purchase radios or books when they became available. Others traded rations of candy for extra writing paper to send letters home. At Camp Shafter, guards joked that the prisoners were better customers than soldiers. They lined up neatly, paid exactly, never argued. A German sergeant named Wilhelm Krauss described the first time he held POW scrip in a letter that later surfaced in the archives. "They pay us for our work. Not with marks, not with dollars, but with small pieces of paper. Yet these papers buy soap, tobacco, and chocolate. I thought it was a trick. Then I bought a bar of chocolate and ate it slowly. It was not a trick. It was America across the country, the same ritual repeated every week. Work, earn, spend. In Kansas, the prisoners harvested wheat. In Louisiana, they cut sugarcane. In Oregon, they felled trees for lumber mills. Each earned the same 80 cents, no more, no less. The standardization was deliberate, fairness encoded in bureaucracy. The canteen itself became a social hub. In the evenings, men gathered there to smoke, talk, and play chess. Transactions were quiet, orderly. A guard sat nearby, reading a magazine, occasionally glancing up as the prisoners thumbed through their scrip. To outsiders, the sight was surreal. Here were former enemies, men who had fought in Rommel's army, now politely buying postcards under the eyes of their captors. Yet within the camp, it felt ordinary. The rules were clear, the routine stable. The American officers understood its psychological power. By giving prisoners a controlled form of economic freedom, they diffused resentment. Idle men brooded. Working men planned, budgeted, imagined futures. The Scrip system turned war prisoners into participants in a miniature economy that mirrored the civility of the world beyond the wire. Not every prisoner embraced it. Some called it play money, dismissing it as a symbol of humiliation. But over time, even the skeptics succumbed to its quiet allure. A pack of cigarettes, a piece of candy, a letter home. These were tangible comforts, small proofs that humanity still existed amid captivity. At Hammond General Hospital's Vernalis branch camp, guards noticed that the prisoners treated their scrip with surprising care. Some folded the notes neatly inside handmade wallets, crafted from cardboard or leather scraps. Others ironed them flat between pages of books to keep them crisp. When the Red Cross delivered parcels from home, they compared the contents with the goods they could buy at the canteen, and often chose the American items for their quality. The design of the scrip itself varied from camp to camp. Some were plain, others ornate. At Camp Cooke, California, the notes bore the U.S. Army seal and the words "issued for use only within POW Canteen." At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, they were printed in shades of blue and gray, featuring a bald eagle perched on a shield. The typography was crisp, the paper thin but durable. For collectors today, these notes are relics. fragile remnants of a strange economy that existed for just 3 years. But for the men who used them, they were daily proof that captivity could contain small freedoms. In one famous incident at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a group of prisoners organized a Christmas market using Scrip. They crafted wooden toys, paintings, and carvings, selling them to one another for a few cents each. The proceeds went toward communal gifts, extra coffee, soap, and stationery for men who had none. The guards, amused, allowed it to continue. Such activities blurred the line between captivity and community. Money, even imaginary money, created order. The POW economy became self-sustaining. Men began offering services, tailoring uniforms, repairing shoes, even sketching portraits of fellow prisoners for a few cents. The Scrip circulated like lifeblood, each note passing through dozens of hands before returning to the Canteen ledger. The Americans monitored it carefully. Camp auditors tracked every note, every transaction. Lost or damaged Scrip had to be reported immediately. Theft was rare, but punished by revocation of privileges. The system worked because it depended on predictability, an invisible contract between captor and captive. By 1945, over $20 million worth of POW Scrip had circulated through American camps. Every penny accounted for, every coupon traceable. Not one documented case of large-scale fraud was ever recorded. In California's agricultural camps, the system took on added significance. The prisoners worked long hours in fields where temperatures reached 100 degrees. Their wages, meager though they seemed, allowed them to buy small comforts that made life bearable. A cold bottle of Coca-Cola after a day in the sun was a revelation. A few cigarettes before lights out was luxury. For some, the Scrip became a symbol of fairness, evidence that even in defeat they were still seen as men deserving compensation. One prisoner later wrote, "We earned money from the enemy, and they paid us honestly." That was when I began to question everything I had been told about them. Others found irony in it. They had once been taught that America was a land of greed and corruption. Yet here, in their captivity, they experienced the most honest economy they had ever known. The Canteen Scrip also served a subtle purpose for the Americans. It reinforced the discipline of self-control. A prisoner who worked well earned more. A prisoner who broke rules lost privileges or access to the canteen. In that sense, the system trained behavior through quiet incentives rather than punishment. The economic order mirrored the democratic one: choice within limits, reward for responsibility, punishment through deprivation, not violence. It was a lesson many prisoners absorbed unconsciously. Late in the war, as German defeat became inevitable, camp commanders noticed a change. The prisoners' spending habits shifted. They bought fewer luxuries and more books. English dictionaries, grammar guides, and American magazines became popular items. Some saved their Scrip to purchase notebooks in which they copied phrases or wrote diaries. A report from Camp Concordia, Kansas, observed the majority of prisoners now prefer education materials over tobacco or sweets. They appear motivated to prepare for post-war life. The same pattern appeared in California. At Camp Lamont, the canteen added new shelves filled with textbooks, novels, and drawing supplies. Within months, they outsold cigarettes. The transformation was remarkable, an economy born of captivity evolving into one driven by self-improvement. As the war drew to a close, the system began to wind down. Repatriation loomed. Camps reduced wages, limiting work assignments to essential labor. By 1946, most canteens had closed, their shelves emptied, their ledgers sealed. The remaining scrip was collected, counted, and burned, a ceremonial end to an invisible economy that had served its purpose. Yet many prisoners smuggled small notes home as keepsakes. Some hid them in boots or stitched them into the linings of jackets. Decades later, survivors would pull them from old boxes, fragile, faded reminders of a strange chapter when they had been paid to work for their enemy and treated with dignity instead of disdain. In interviews conducted years after the war, former prisoners often mentioned the Canteen scrip as a turning point in their perception of America. It wasn't the luxury that impressed them, the chocolate or cigarettes, but the principle. The idea that fairness could exist even in confinement. Lieutenant Carl Meissner, who had once labored in California's cotton fields, put it simply in his memoirs. They gave us paper money that was worthless beyond the fence, yet it bought us freedom inside the fence. That was enough. The POW Canteen scrip system remains one of the most remarkable examples of controlled humanity in wartime history. It balanced practicality with principle, efficiency with empathy. The Americans could have ignored the Geneva Convention. They could have used forced labor without pay. Instead, they built an economic mirror of their own society, one that reflected order, fairness, and accountability. Through that system, thousands of German soldiers experienced democracy not as ideology, but as daily routine, standing in line, earning wages, buying what they pleased. It was an education delivered not through lectures, but through commerce. When the men returned to Germany, many carried those lessons with them. They had seen an economy built on trust, not coercion. A system where money represented freedom, not domination. It influenced the way they rebuilt their lives, their businesses, and eventually their country. For a few, the scrip became a metaphor for the post-war world itself, fragile, uncertain, but real enough to build upon. In a sense, it was America's quiet message to its former enemies, that even in defeat, dignity could be restored one transaction at a time. Today, the faded paper notes sit in museums and private collections, ghosts of a vanished currency that once circulated behind barbed wire. They bear the creases of hands that had built tanks, fired rifles, and surrendered in deserts half a world away. They tell a story not of wealth, but of redemption, of men who discovered, through the smallest tokens of exchange, that respect and fairness could survive even in captivity. For those prisoners, each coupon spent in a dusty canteen was more than a purchase. It was proof that they were still human, and that, perhaps, was worth more than money. July 1943. The Central Valley lay shimmering beneath a haze of summer heat. Dust swirled over the flatlands like smoke from an invisible fire. The wheat stood dry and golden, the orchards heavy with fruit, and the tomato vines thick with green promise. But in field after field, there was one thing missing: men. The war had emptied California's farms. The draft had taken fathers, sons, and hired hands. Young men who once plowed the earth were now flying bombers over Europe or driving tanks through North Africa. Those left behind, women, old men, and children, struggled to keep up. Tractors rusted in barns, unharvested crops spoiled in the heat, and fields that had once fed cities stood half fallow beneath the relentless sun. By mid-1943, the crisis had reached breaking point. California, the nation's largest producer of fruits, vegetables, and cotton, faced a harvest season it could not complete. Newspapers carried desperate headlines: Valley farmers plead for help. Crops rot as manpower vanishes. The problem was not just local. The entire American food supply was at risk. Every tomato unpicked, every peach left to fall, meant fewer rations for soldiers overseas. The US government scrambled for solutions. The Women's Land Army was mobilized. High school students volunteered during the summers. Migrant laborers were recruited from Mexico under the Bracero program. Even inmates from state prisons were temporarily released to work the fields. But still the shortage grew. California needed hands, any hands, and fast. In Washington, the War Manpower Commission began exploring an unorthodox idea. America was holding tens of thousands of Axis prisoners in camps scattered across the country. Most were Germans captured in North Africa, veterans of the Africa Corps who had surrendered to Allied forces. They were sitting in fenced compounds, fed and idle. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be forced to fight, but they could be employed in non-military labor, provided they were paid and treated fairly. The math was simple. California had the fields, America had the prisoners. By late 1943, the plan was approved. The US Army, working with the Department of Agriculture, began transporting German prisoners to rural labor camps across the state. The arrangement was practical, almost mechanical in its logic. Farmers would apply through local farm bureaus, requesting a set number of workers. The government would supply them, guarded, organized, and insured at a fixed wage of 80 cents per day, credited in Canteen Scrip. At first, the idea stirred controversy. Some Californians were furious. "Our boys are fighting and dying overseas," wrote one letter to the Bakersfield Californian, "and we're giving their enemies steady work and good food." Others argued the opposite, that leaving food to rot was itself a betrayal of the war effort. Governor Earl Warren, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, publicly supported the program. "The German prisoners," he said, "will save California's crops and serve the cause of victory." The first busloads of prisoners arrived in the Central Valley in the fall of 1943. They were driven in covered army trucks marked with bold black letters, PW, and escorted by guards with rifles slung over their shoulders. The locals watched in silence as the trucks passed. Dozens of young men with close-cropped hair, their grey uniforms still bearing the faint outlines of former insignia. They were the enemy. Yet here they were, arriving to help feed the very nation they had tried to destroy. The buses stopped at temporary branch camps built near towns like Lamont, Shafter, Blythe, and Stockton. Rows of wooden barracks went up almost overnight. Fences were strung, watchtowers erected, kitchens stocked. Within weeks, thousands of German prisoners were working across California's farmlands. The schedule was relentless. Each morning, long before sunrise, guards walked the barracks, shouting roll call. The prisoners filed out, boarded buses, and rode for miles across the sleeping valley. They arrived in the fields at dawn, when the air was still cool and the sky faintly purple. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The men worked in silence, stooping, cutting, stacking, filling crates. The fields shimmered with motion, rows of grey uniforms bending in rhythm beneath the white sun. For many of the farmers, the sight was jarring. They had expected hostility, resentment, even sabotage. Instead, the Germans worked with surprising discipline. Years of military training had instilled habits of obedience and precision. Orders were followed, rows were kept straight, equipment was cleaned and returned. They worked like clockwork, one farmer later recalled, You could set your watch by them. At 8, they were in the rows. At 12, they stopped for lunch. At 5, they were onto the truck, all lined up neat as you please. The guards soon learned that strictness was unnecessary. Escape was rare. Where could they go? Beyond the fields stretched miles of desert and farmland, dotted with small towns where every stranger stood out. Some prisoners joked that America was too big to run from. The labor system evolved quickly. Farmers paid the government, not the prisoners directly. The War Department handled payroll and deductions, crediting each man's account with his daily wage. In return, the prisoners received the right to shop at the camp canteen. The arrangement was efficient, almost corporate in its precision, an economy of captivity functioning in parallel with the wartime economy, beyond the fences. By early 1944, the program was considered a success. German labor had saved the cotton and tomato harvests. Orchards that had once been half abandoned now filled with workers again. Only this time, the workers spoke German. In Kern County alone, over 3,000 prisoners were employed during the summer peak. Across the state, the number rose to nearly 15,000. The American farmers who once eyed the prisoners with suspicion began to change their tone. They were no longer the enemy. They were the help. Some even grew fond of them. A few farmers brought their families to watch the men work, curious children waving at soldiers who smiled back shyly. In some towns, local newspapers ran small human interest stories. Former German soldiers pick peaches near Stockton. The irony was never lost on the prisoners. They had once marched across Europe under banners promising conquest and dominance. Now, they bent their backs to the California soil, paid 80 cents a day by the nation they had been told was collapsing under its own decadence. Yet the work, for many, brought unexpected peace. There was rhythm in the labor, purpose in the harvest. Some even took pride in their output. Private Günter Weiss, captured in Tunisia, wrote in his journal, "We came as enemies, but here we are treated as workers. The Americans trust the land more than they trust us, yet they trust us enough to give us their land. It is a strange kind of respect." The system became routine. Every morning, convoys of buses and trucks fanned out from camps across the valley, dispersing thousands of prisoners into the fields. Guards sat up front, reading newspapers or dozing as the vehicles rumbled through the endless landscape. At the end of the day, the process reversed. The prisoners were counted, searched, and returned. The system worked with military precision, a perfect fusion of American logistics and German discipline. Not all were comfortable with it. A few local workers resented the presence of enemy labor. Labor unions protested, arguing that the government was undercutting wages by using prisoners instead of free men. The War Department countered that the POWs were a temporary emergency measure. As soon as the war ended, they would be sent home. In practice, the program continued until nearly every crop had been saved. Even delicate harvests like peaches and grapes, which required careful handling, were entrusted to German hands. Farmers taught the prisoners how to prune, how to pack fruit without bruising it, how to operate machinery. The learning was fast. Within months, they were experts. The government enforced strict codes of conduct to maintain public confidence. Guards were ordered to remain professional at all times. Civilians were discouraged from fraternizing with prisoners, though the rules were often ignored. In small towns, friendships formed quietly. Some guards brought coffee to share during breaks. A few farmers exchanged letters with the men after they were repatriated. At Hammond General Hospital in San Joaquin County, a special arrangement was made to supply fresh produce for wounded soldiers. Each morning, trucks filled with German laborers left Vernalis branch camp and headed for the tomato fields nearby. The vegetables they picked went straight to the hospital kitchens. The irony was sharp. Men who had once fought American soldiers now harvesting food to feed them. The program's efficiency impressed even its critics. The War Department compiled detailed statistics showing productivity equal to or greater than that of civilian crews. Absenteeism was nearly zero. Equipment losses were minimal. The prisoners' military precision, once a tool of war, had been turned to peaceful use. By 1945, the system had spread to nearly every major agricultural region in the state. From the citrus groves of Riverside to the cotton fields of Tulare, the POW buses became a familiar sight. Their arrival at sunrise marked the beginning of another day's work, their departure at dusk, the promise of another saved harvest. The economic impact was enormous. The Department of Agriculture estimated that German labor saved crops worth more than $50 million, over $700 million in today's value. Without it, California's food supply might have collapsed. The prisoners' contribution fed not only America, but the Allied armies fighting overseas. Yet beyond the statistics, the psychological effect was equally profound. The sight of enemies working peacefully under the same sun that shone over American towns shaped perceptions on both sides. For the farmers, it humanized the men behind the gray uniforms. For the prisoners, it dismantled the myths they had carried across the ocean. One farmer near Bakersfield remembered a moment that changed his view forever. I was walking the rows when I saw one of them, a young fella, maybe 20, stop and pick up a sparrow that had fallen from a nest. He set it back in the branches, real gentle. That's when it hit me. He wasn't a monster, just a boy. When news of Germany's surrender reached the camps in May 1945, work continued almost without pause. The war might have ended, but the harvest did not wait. Many prisoners volunteered to stay until the season's end. They wanted to see the job finished. For some, leaving was bittersweet. The fields had become familiar, the routine comforting. They had found a strange sense of belonging in the rhythm of American agriculture. Years later, in interviews, former prisoners spoke of those days with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "We were the enemy," one said, "and they trusted us with their food. They paid us, fed us, treated us fairly. It was the beginning of our education in what freedom really meant." When the repatriation ships finally departed from New York and New Orleans in 1946, many carried home not just memories, but lessons. They had witnessed an industrial democracy that could harness even its enemies for production rather than punishment. They had seen a nation that fought fiercely, yet treated captives with dignity. California's farms returned to normal soon after. The veterans came home, the temporary camps were dismantled, and the buses vanished from the roads. But traces of the POW era lingered. The repaired irrigation canals, the expanded barns, the fields that had stayed alive through those critical years. In 1947, the Department of Agriculture quietly released its final report on the program. It described the German prisoner labor system as an unqualified success. Behind that bureaucratic phrase lay a deeper truth. The system had proven that decency and practicality could coexist, even in war. And for the men who had once served under a banner of conquest, it proved something else. That the real measure of power was not domination, but productivity. Under the California sun, far from the ruins of Europe, they learned that lesson in rows of tomatoes, in baskets of cotton, in the quiet fairness of 80 cents a day. Their story remains one of history's quiet miracles. a time when former enemies, bound by necessity and discipline, kept a nation fed, and in doing so, began to understand one another not as conquerors or captives, but simply as men. March 12, 1944. Lompoc, California. The Pacific fog drifted inland before sunrise, rolling over the hills of Santa Barbara County and pooling against the fences of Camp Cooke. To the men standing at morning formation, the air smelled faintly of salt and sagebrush, the soil still damp from the night's chill. Beyond the wire, rows of eucalyptus trees shivered in the wind, their long shadows slicing across the open field where German prisoners assembled in silence. At 0600, the bugle sounded, and 5,000 men of the Africa Corps, captured in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through Norfolk and Texas, stood at attention in the heart of America's central coast. Camp Cooke was not supposed to exist. It had been carved out of rolling ranch land in 1941 as a training ground for tank divisions, artillery regiments, and the new mechanized infantry that would carry America's war machine across Europe. But by late 1943, as American forces pushed deeper into the Mediterranean, the camp's purpose shifted. The barracks that once held recruits now held their enemies. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers expanded the facility in record time, constructing hundreds of wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, and guard towers, an entire city behind barbed wire. It would become one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps on the Pacific coast. To the prisoners who arrived by train from the port of San Pedro, the first impression was startling. They had expected rough stockades or open pens. Instead, they saw rows of neat buildings with painted numbers, electric lights, running water, and kitchens large enough to feed an army. Inside each barrack, 30 bunks lined the walls with folded blankets and iron stoves at the center. Latrines had porcelain fixtures and hot showers, luxuries many hadn't seen since leaving home. A few muttered under their breath that even German soldiers on leave had never lived so well. It was, one officer wrote in his diary, a strange paradise built by our conquerors. The commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Miller, ran Camp Cooke with a philosophy that mirrored the letter of the Geneva Convention. The men were to be treated not as criminals, but as enemy soldiers awaiting repatriation. Guards were instructed to maintain strict discipline but absolute fairness. Punishments were to be minimal, collective reprisals forbidden. The result was a machine of order, German efficiency contained within American bureaucracy. Each day began with the clang of the camp bell at dawn. Roll call followed, the prisoners responding in crisp German cadence as officers moved down the lines checking names against rosters typed in triplicate. Breakfast was served in the mess hall. Oatmeal, bread, jam, and coffee brewed by the gallon. The quality of the food astonished them. Private Heinrich Wendt, captured near Bizerta, recorded in a letter smuggled through the Red Cross, "They feed us as if we were their own. I have not been hungry once since arriving." After breakfast came the daily assignments. The majority of the men were sent out in trucks to work the surrounding farms. California's central coast was rich in produce, lettuce, sugar beets, and beans, and the war had stripped the fields of labor. With thousands of American farmhands drafted and migrant labor diverted to war industries, German POWs became the solution. Under armed supervision, they harvested crops from sunrise to dusk, earning 80 cents per day in Canteen Scrip. Paper coupons redeemable only within the camp store. It was a closed economy, but one that operated with precision. The Scrip could buy cigarettes, soap, shaving cream, or postcards. Some saved their earnings to send Red Cross parcels home. Others spent them on harmonicas, chess sets, or notebooks. In the evenings, the barracks flickered with the glow of small reading lamps purchased with POW wages. The psychological impact of that pay system was profound. They had been told Americans enslaved their enemies, that prisoners would be starved or shot. Instead, they were compensated, issued receipts, and thanked for their labor. The guards spoke to them politely. The work trucks returned each evening without casualties. For men who had endured the chaos of North Africa, the orderliness of California's harvest felt unreal. Within the camp itself, daily life developed its own rhythm. The prisoners organized orchestras, theater troupes, and sports leagues. Every Sunday afternoon, soccer matches drew hundreds of spectators, Germans cheering against Germans under the watch of American guards. The camp band performed waltzes and marches on the parade ground. Red Cross shipments brought instruments, books, and magazines. The YMCA provided art supplies and even built a small chapel for worship services. To outside observers, Camp Cooke seemed less like a prison and more like a self-contained European village transplanted to the American coast. Yet the underlying discipline never wavered. The guards were mostly young Americans from the Midwest, farmers, students, factory workers assigned to the military police. They were instructed to remain detached, but many found themselves quietly impressed by the prisoners' precision and courtesy. They ran their barracks cleaner than we ran ours, one sergeant later recalled. If you dropped a cigarette butt, a German would pick it up before you could bend down. Fraternization was forbidden, but conversations inevitably developed. Guards shared cigarettes. Prisoners shared stories of the Desert War. One recalled his capture at Kasserine, another his last flight over Tobruk. To many guards, these weren't monsters, but weary men far from home. Medical care at Camp Cooke rivaled that of American installations. A full hospital operated inside the wire, staffed by US Army doctors, with German medics assisting. Prisoners received dental care, surgeries, and new eyeglasses. Vaccinations were administered on schedule. The contrast with conditions in German field hospitals was impossible to ignore. One prisoner, a former nurse from Hamburg, wrote in his diary, "They heal us while we are their enemies." What then will they do when peace comes? The most remarkable feature of Camp Cooke was its educational program. The War Department's Special Projects Division, working with the YMCA and universities like Stanford and UCLA, introduced voluntary classes in English, mathematics, and American civics. Classrooms were set up in converted barracks, chalkboards hung on plywood walls. The curriculum avoided propaganda, but emphasized factual learning, how democracy functioned, how American industry operated, how a free press worked. By 1945, nearly half the camp's population was enrolled. Graduates received certificates printed with both the US Army Seal and the German Eagle, an ironic pairing that symbolized the transformation taking place behind barbed wire. Outside the camp, local civilians encountered the prisoners daily. Trucks carrying POW labor crews rumbled down the roads each morning, marked with large PW letters. Farmers were initially nervous, but quickly realized the Germans worked hard and caused no trouble. The arrangement benefited everyone. The government paid the farmers by the acre, the farmers paid the War Department, and the prisoners received credit in Scrip. The result was a smoothly functioning triangle of labor that kept California agriculture alive. Reports from the Department of Agriculture credited POW labor with saving millions of dollars in crops during 1944 alone. one farmer from Santa Maria recalled decades later. They were polite, efficient, and grateful. We gave them sandwiches and coffee at noon. They worked like they had something to prove. That small kindness was not forgotten. Many prisoners later wrote letters of thanks after returning to Germany, describing American farmers as the kindest enemies imaginable. Not every day at Camp Cooke was peaceful. Tensions simmered beneath the surface between hardline Nazis and ordinary soldiers. A small but vocal minority refused to cooperate, calling the others Verräter, traitors, for working with Americans. Fights occasionally broke out in the barracks. The commandant responded by isolating agitators in a separate enclosure known as the segregation compound. There, the strictest discipline prevailed. Yet even these punishments adhered to regulation. No beatings, no starvation. Only isolation and bread and water rations. The system worked. Within months, the extremists lost their influence, replaced by pragmatists who simply wanted to survive. As months passed, the contrast between Germany's collapse and the order of American captivity grew harder to ignore. Newspapers arrived weekly under censorship, carrying reports of bombings in Hamburg, shortages in Berlin, and advances by Allied armies. Prisoners read the headlines in stunned silence. Some refused to believe them. Others wept quietly in their bunks. One diary entry captured the mood. "Our homeland lies in ruins, and here the lights burn all night." For many, the experience became a moral education as much as a political one. They saw guards who enforced rules without cruelty, officers who maintained authority without arrogance, and a system that ran on laws rather than ideology. It was, in its own way, a living lesson in democracy. In June 1945, with Germany defeated, the tone inside Camp Cooke changed again. The prisoners were no longer enemies, but displaced men waiting to go home. Repatriation required months of paperwork and coordination through the Red Cross. In the meantime, daily life continued with routine precision. Gardens flourished, workshops produced furniture for nearby bases, and the orchestra played farewell concerts. The camp newspaper, Die Brücke, The Bridge, published articles in both German and English promoting reconciliation and education. The editor, a former schoolteacher from Cologne, wrote, "We have learned more of civilization here in 2 years than in a decade of war." That summer, groups of prisoners began departing by train for the East Coast ports. The departures were quiet affairs. No speeches, no ceremony. Trucks carried the men to the railhead under the same fog that had greeted them 2 years earlier. Many left small gifts behind, carved wooden boxes, paintings, or hand-sewn flags. Some exchanged addresses with guards who had once been their captors. One sergeant kept a note folded in his wallet until his death. "To the man who guarded me with honor, thank you." When the last train pulled away from Camp Cooke in early 1946, the compound fell silent. The barracks were dismantled, the fences removed. The army reclaimed the land for new purposes. Within a decade, it would become Vandenberg Air Force Base, the launch site for America's first missiles and satellites. Yet beneath the concrete and steel of the space age lay the memory of a different kind of experiment. One in which the United States had tested the strength of its own ideals and found them unbroken. Historians who later studied the records of Camp Cooke found meticulous documentation, inspection reports, pay ledgers, medical charts, and letters from prisoners. They revealed a system that had operated not merely as a detention center, but as a microcosm of American governance, ordered, bureaucratic, and surprisingly humane. The Red Cross inspection from October 1944 concluded simply, treatment excellent, discipline firm but fair, morale good, prisoners healthy and cooperative. In the language of war, there was no higher praise. Years later, when former prisoners were interviewed in Germany, many spoke of Camp Cooke with something approaching gratitude. One, an engineer named Otto Schäfer, told a reporter, "They defeated us, but they did not humiliate us. They showed us that strength can have mercy." Another, a farmer from Saxony, remembered the lettuce fields of Lompoc. "We picked crops to feed the country we had been taught to hate. They paid us for it." That payment, small as it was, changed everything. The legacy of Camp Cooke extended far beyond its fences. When those men returned to post-war Germany, they carried more than memories. They brought with them an understanding of how a free society functioned, its laws, its efficiency, its tolerance. Many became teachers, engineers, and administrators during the reconstruction of West Germany. The lessons learned in the California sun, punctuality, fairness, self-governance, became cornerstones of the democratic republic that rose from the ruins. In 1985, a reunion of former German POWs was held near Lompoc. A few dozen elderly men returned to see what had become of the camp. Most of the original structures were gone, replaced by launch pads and radar towers. But when they stood on the hillside overlooking the base, they could still trace the outline of the old parade ground. One placed a small wooden cross in the soil and whispered, "Hier haben wir gelernt." Here we learned. The fog rolled in again that evening, soft and grey, just as it had in 1944. The past was buried under concrete and history, but its meaning remained. In the quiet fields of California's coast, thousands of men had discovered that their enemy's greatest weapon was not the rifle or the tank, but the rule of law, the ability to win without hatred, to govern without cruelty, and to treat even captives as human beings. That, more than any lesson written in propaganda, was the revelation of Camp Cooke. It was a school built by war, but dedicated to peace.